Some people spend millions trying to change the world. Sometimes all it takes is one small hug to change a single heart. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their warm light dancing across polished marble floors and tables dressed in white linen. Waiters moved quietly through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with sparkling cider and elegant desserts, while cameras flashed from every corner of the grand charity gala. It was the kind of evening magazines loved to cover, where successful entrepreneurs, celebrities, and philanthropists gathered to celebrate generosity in front of an audience that applauded almost everything. At the center of it all stood Ethan Carter, one of the country's most admired millionaire CEOs. Tall, composed, and dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, he accepted another standing ovation with the same restrained smile he always wore. For years, newspapers had praised his business instincts, his record-breaking donations, and his ability to rebuild struggling communities through his foundation. Tonight was no different. Moments earlier, he had signed a ceremonial check worth $5 million for children's education, and the room erupted into thunderous applause. Phones lifted into the air, photographers leaned forward, and reporters whispered that tomorrow's headlines had already written themselves. Ethan nodded politely, shook hands with the event organizers, and prepared to leave the stage. He had done this hundreds of times before. Give, smile, wave, leave. Everything followed a schedule as precise as the expensive watch resting beneath his cuff. Then something unexpected happened. Just as he stepped away from the microphone, he felt the tiniest tug against the sleeve of his jacket. It was so gentle that he almost mistook it for the brush of fabric. He turned slowly. Standing beside him was a little girl no older than 7. Her neatly brushed blonde hair rested on her shoulders beneath a pale blue ribbon. She wore a simple white dress that had clearly been cared for with love despite its age, along with clean shoes that had seen many careful repairs. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frightened. She simply looked up at him with calm blue eyes that carried far more hope than sadness. Around her neck hung a paper name tag identifying her as one of the children invited from a local family shelter to attend the evening's celebration. The conversations around them softened. Cameras instinctively shifted toward the pair. Ethan offered the same courteous smile he gave everyone. "Hello there," he said gently. "Did you enjoy the party?" The little girl nodded once. Then she asked the question no one in the ballroom expected. "Sir, may I have just one hug?" Silence arrived so suddenly it almost had a sound of its own. Hundreds of guests froze where they stood. A violinist slowly lowered her bow. Even the photographers hesitated before pressing another shutter. Ethan remained completely still. The request should have been easy. It cost nothing. It required no board approval, no financial report, no legal review. And yet the simple words seemed to echo through every quiet corner of his heart. The little girl waited patiently, never reaching for him, never repeating herself. She simply stood there, believing that perhaps someone who could give away millions might still have one hug left to give. Ethan looked into her eyes for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he quietly set the microphone back onto its stand, stepped away from the spotlight, and said something that no one in that room would ever forget. The little girl never looked away. She stood with both hands folded in front of her, patient in a way that children rarely had to be, as though she already understood that some answers took time to find. Ethan Carter lowered his eyes for only a moment before kneeling until they were at the same height. The room expected him to politely decline. Some anticipated a carefully rehearsed speech about generosity, kindness, or hope. Instead, he smiled with a softness no camera had ever captured before. "I think," he said quietly, "I might need that hug just as much as you do." A quiet gasp drifted through the ballroom. Before anyone could react, the little girl stepped forward, wrapped her small arms around his shoulders, and rested her head gently against his chest. Ethan closed his eyes. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The applause that had filled the room only moments earlier disappeared into complete silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that arrives when hundreds of people suddenly realize they are witnessing something too honest to interrupt. Ethan could hear nothing except the slow rhythm of his own heartbeat. It had been years since another human being had embraced him without asking for anything in return. Years since affection had entered his carefully ordered life without an appointment on a calendar. When the little girl finally stepped back, she smiled as though she had received exactly what she came for. Then she quietly returned to stand beside the other children from the shelter, leaving Ethan standing alone beneath the lights with an expression no one recognized. The master of ceremonies attempted to continue the evening, but something had shifted. The polished speeches suddenly sounded less important. The expensive decorations seemed quieter. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, sensing that the most unforgettable photograph of the night had already been taken. Ethan remained on the stage long after everyone expected him to leave. His eyes wandered through the ballroom without truly seeing it. Instead, memories drifted into places he had spent years trying to keep locked away. There had once been another little hand that reached for his. Another bright laugh echoing through a home that had not always been silent. Long before magazine covers, billion-dollar negotiations, and private jets, there had been evenings filled with bedtime stories, homemade pancakes on Saturday mornings, and tiny arms that wrapped around his neck every time he walked through the front door. Then life changed in ways no amount of success could repair. Loss had arrived quietly, leaving behind a house that still looked complete from the outside but no longer felt alive inside. Ethan buried himself in work because numbers never reminded him of what was missing. Buildings could be constructed, companies could grow, markets could recover, but some empty spaces refused to be filled by achievement. Over time, he stopped noticing that he no longer shook hands for very long. He quietly avoided photographs where strangers leaned too close. Even congratulations became polite nods instead of embraces. People called him disciplined. They admired his composure. No one realized he had simply forgotten how to let another person near the part of him that still hurt. Tonight, a 7-year-old girl had crossed that invisible distance without even realizing it. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Carter wondered whether the strongest walls he had ever built had never surrounded his business empire at all. They had surrounded his own heart. The gala ended later than expected, but Ethan Carter did not leave with the same quiet certainty he carried into every public event. His driver opened the door of the waiting black sedan, yet Ethan remained standing on the sidewalk, watching the children from the family shelter board a small white bus. They laughed together over gift bags and warm cookies, their voices floating into the cool evening air. The little girl with the blue ribbon climbed the steps last. Before disappearing inside, she turned around, spotted Ethan across the parking area, and lifted one small hand in a cheerful wave. He raised his hand in return almost without thinking. The bus pulled away, its red taillights fading into the city traffic, but something inside him refused to move on quite so easily. During the drive home, the city lights reflected across the window beside him, blurring into long ribbons of gold. His phone buzzed repeatedly with congratulatory messages. Business partners praised another successful fundraiser. News outlets were already posting photographs from the evening. His assistant informed him that the video of his unexpected embrace had begun spreading across social media. Ethan read none of it. Instead, he stared out at familiar streets that somehow looked different tonight. For years, he had measured success by numbers: quarterly earnings, foundation grants, scholarships funded, buildings completed. Every achievement had a figure attached to it. Yet one simple hug refused to fit inside any report he had ever studied. It lingered in his thoughts because it had not been earned, purchased, or planned. It had simply been given. The next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter Global Headquarters, casting bright reflections across polished stone and glass. Executives gathered inside the boardroom carrying tablets, financial summaries, and schedules packed down to the minute. Ethan entered exactly on time, as he always did. The room immediately fell silent. The meeting began with market forecasts and investment proposals, but Ethan found himself distracted by something unusual. Resting near his notebook was a small envelope that had not been there earlier. There was no company logo, no official seal, only his name written carefully in uneven handwriting. Curious, he opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of construction paper decorated with hand-drawn stars and tiny blue hearts. The message was written in large pencil letters. "Thank you for hugging me. Some people give toys. Some people give food. You made me feel like somebody remembered I was there. Love, Sophie." Ethan read the note twice, then a third time. Tucked inside was a simple photograph taken during the gala. It showed the moment they had embraced. Neither of them faced the camera. There were no smiles meant for an audience. Only two people standing completely still while the world seemed to disappear around them. Ethan carefully placed the photograph back into the envelope instead of handing it to his assistant with the rest of the correspondence. Throughout the meeting, every financial chart seemed strangely distant. Words such as growth, expansion, acquisition, and valuation echoed around the room, but another sentence quietly repeated itself inside his mind. You made me feel like somebody remembered I was there. Late that afternoon, after the final presentation concluded, Ethan surprised everyone by canceling 2 non-essential appointments. His assistant looked confused because he almost never changed his calendar. Is everything all right, Mr. Carter? She asked gently. Ethan looked once more at the handmade card resting on his desk before slipping it carefully into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Then he offered a quiet smile that carried more warmth than certainty. I think, he answered softly, there is someone I would like to remember too. That afternoon, Ethan drove himself instead of asking for his usual driver. It was a decision so unusual that even he could not fully explain it. The address printed at the bottom of the invitation from the charity led him away from downtown skyscrapers and into a quiet neighborhood where tree-lined streets replaced busy intersections. Nestled between an elementary school and a small public library stood the Maple Grove Family Shelter, a modest brick building surrounded by flower beds carefully tended by volunteers. Children's drawings decorated the front windows, each one filled with bright suns, smiling stick figures, colorful houses, and hopeful messages written in oversized letters. Ethan parked across the street for several minutes before stepping out. He realized he felt strangely nervous. Negotiating billion-dollar contracts had never made his hands hesitate, yet walking toward one small building somehow did. Inside, the shelter smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon. Laughter echoed from a recreation room where several children sat around long wooden tables working on art projects with colored pencils and construction paper. A volunteer greeted Ethan warmly before recognizing him from the previous evening. Mr. Carter, she said with genuine surprise. We were not expecting you. Ethan smiled politely. I was hoping to visit someone if that is all right. Before she could answer, an older woman wearing a light gray cardigan approached from the hallway. Her name tag identified her as Margaret Ellis, director. She extended her hand, and Ethan accepted it without thinking, noticing afterward that the simple gesture no longer felt uncomfortable. Margaret welcomed him into her office, where framed photographs of smiling families covered nearly every wall. There were no awards displayed, only memories. As they sat together over cups of hot tea, Ethan explained that he had come because of Sophie. Margaret's expression softened immediately. She talks about you, she said with a quiet smile. Mostly about your eyes. Ethan looked puzzled. My eyes? Margaret nodded. She said they looked lonely before you smiled. Ethan lowered his cup without speaking. No financial analyst had ever described him that accurately. No interviewer had ever noticed. Yet somehow a 7-year-old child had. Margaret reached into a nearby cabinet and removed a small memory box decorated with blue ribbon. There is something I think you should see, she said gently. Inside were carefully folded drawings, birthday cards from volunteers, and dozens of handwritten notes. Each one ended almost exactly the same way. Thank you for the hug. Ethan looked up in confusion. Margaret quietly explained that after Sophie's mother passed away from a long illness nearly 2 years earlier, Sophie rarely asked anyone for toys, candy, or presents. Every time a visitor came to the shelter, she had only one request. One hug. Nothing more. Sometimes people smiled and embraced her. Sometimes they were too busy. Sometimes they apologized and hurried away. Sophie never complained. She simply thanked each person who stopped long enough to remind her that she mattered. Margaret lifted one faded drawing from the box. It showed a little girl standing beside a much taller figure beneath a bright yellow sun. Above them, written in careful block letters, were the words, Hugs make lonely hearts remember how to smile. Ethan stared at the picture for a long time before asking quietly, Does she know how many people she has helped? Margaret smiled with gentle certainty. I do not think she believes she is helping anyone. She thinks she is only collecting enough hugs to last until she grows up. At that exact moment, laughter drifted down the hallway, followed by quick footsteps. Before Ethan could turn toward the door, A familiar, cheerful voice filled the room. "Mr. Carter, you came back. I was hoping you would remember me." Sophie stood in the doorway with the same gentle smile Ethan remembered from the gala. But this time there were no cameras, no applause, and no bright stage lights surrounding them. She wore a light blue sweater over her white dress, and her blonde hair was tied back with the familiar ribbon that seemed to brighten the entire hallway. In her hands, she carried a small notebook whose corners had softened from being opened so many times. "I knew you would come," she said with complete confidence. Ethan could not help smiling. "How could you possibly know that?" Sophie shrugged with the simple certainty only a child could have. "Because you look like someone who keeps promises, even the ones you never say out loud." Margaret quietly excused herself, leaving the two of them to wander through the shelter together. Sophie eagerly showed him everything as though she were welcoming an old friend into her home. She pointed out the reading corner where volunteers gathered every Tuesday evening, the tiny kitchen where everyone baked birthday cupcakes together, and a small garden behind the building where children planted flowers each spring. Every room held signs of people trying their best to build hope from ordinary days. Eventually, they reached a quiet bench beneath a large maple tree in the backyard. Sophie climbed onto the wooden seat and carefully opened her notebook. Inside were dozens of colorful drawings, each one showing people hugging. Some pictures were simple stick figures. Others were detailed with smiling faces, bright skies, and handwritten captions. Ethan slowly turned each page until one drawing caught his attention. It showed a little girl holding the hand of a woman with long blonde hair beneath a sky filled with blue birds. On the opposite page was an envelope folded neatly with great care. Sophie lifted it gently. "My mom wrote this for me," she whispered. "She told me not to open it until I felt really lonely." Ethan remained silent while Sophie unfolded the letter with tiny, careful hands. The paper had become soft from being read many times. She smiled before reading the familiar words aloud. "My sweet Sophie, if one day I cannot walk beside you anymore, promise me something. Never stop asking for hugs. Some people think hugs are only for children, but they are wrong. There are grown-ups carrying hearts that feel much lonelier than yours. One day you will meet someone who needs your hug more than you need theirs. When that day comes, do not be afraid to ask. You might remind them that love is still waiting." Sophie looked up, her blue eyes shining in the afternoon sunlight. "I think my mom was talking about you." Ethan felt his throat tighten as he accepted the letter with both hands. The handwriting reminded him of family recipes, birthday cards, and all the ordinary treasures people never realize they will one day miss. He carefully handed it back to Sophie. "Your mother was a very wise woman," he said softly. Sophie nodded. "She always said hugs are not gifts you keep. They are gifts you pass along." A cool breeze stirred the maple leaves above them, sending tiny patches of sunlight dancing across the grass. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words suddenly felt too small. Ethan simply sat beside Sophie on the weathered bench, realizing that every success he had ever celebrated suddenly seemed less remarkable than one handwritten letter folded inside a little girl's notebook. Somewhere deep inside the walls he had spent years building around his heart, another quiet crack appeared, and for the first time he did not want to repair it. Over the following weeks, Ethan found himself taking unfamiliar routes through the city. Instead of driving directly from his office to his quiet penthouse each evening, he often turned toward Maple Grove Family Shelter without checking his calendar first. At the beginning, he convinced himself the visits were temporary. He told his assistant he simply wanted to better understand the programs his foundation supported. But after the third visit, even he stopped pretending. He was not returning because of reports or donations. He was returning because someone there remembered how to make silence feel comfortable instead of empty. Sophie greeted him every single time with the same bright smile, never asking whether he would come back again because she had already decided he would. Together they built small routines that slowly became the favorite parts of Ethan's week. On Tuesday afternoons they read adventure stories in the library corner, taking turns giving different voices to each character until the younger children laughed so hard they forgot to sit still. On Saturdays, they baked chocolate chip cookies in the shelter kitchen, covering the countertops with flour while Sophie insisted that the cookies tasted better whenever someone smiled while mixing the dough. Ethan had never considered baking relaxing, yet somehow those simple afternoons felt lighter than any vacation he had taken in years. One rainy evening, Sophie invited him to help paint a mural across the recreation room wall. The children had chosen the theme themselves. Instead of castles or superheroes, they wanted a giant tree whose branches stretched across the room, with colorful paper leaves carrying the names of everyone who had ever shown them kindness. Ethan spent nearly an hour painting one small branch, while Sophie carefully pressed paper leaves into place. When she handed him a blue paper leaf and a marker, he looked at her with quiet curiosity. "Whose name should I write?" he asked. Sophie smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Yours," she replied. Ethan hesitated. "I do not think I belong beside all these wonderful people." Sophie gently shook her head. "Kind people always think that." Without another word, she took the marker and carefully wrote Ethan Carter in neat block letters before handing him the finished leaf. Together, they climbed a short step stool and placed it near the center of the tree, where sunlight from the nearby windows touched it every afternoon. Something about seeing his own name surrounded by teachers, volunteers, cooks, librarians, and neighbors moved him more deeply than any award hanging in his office ever had. The changes slowly reached beyond the shelter. Employees at Carter Global noticed that Ethan lingered in conversations instead of ending them as quickly as possible. He began asking receptionists about their families, remembered birthdays without reminders, and occasionally joined staff members for lunch instead of eating alone in his office. During one meeting, a nervous intern accidentally spilled coffee across a presentation binder. Months earlier, Ethan would have quietly replaced the employee on the project. Instead, he smiled, handed over a stack of napkins, and said, "The report can be printed again. People cannot." The room fell silent, surprised by the unexpected warmth in his voice. Late one afternoon, after another visit to Maple Grove, Ethan unlocked the front door of his penthouse and paused. The silence waiting inside no longer felt peaceful. It simply felt unfinished. For the first time in many years, he walked into the storage room at the end of the hallway, opened a dusty cardboard box, and carefully removed framed photographs he had hidden away after losing his family. One by one, he placed them back where they had once belonged. As the evening sunlight settled across the room, the home no longer looked like a museum built for one lonely man. It looked like a place where memories were finally being welcomed back instead of locked away. As autumn slowly settled over the city, Ethan's visits to Maple Grove became part of a rhythm that no business calendar had ever managed to create. The shelter staff smiled whenever his car appeared in the parking lot, and the children ran to the front door before he could even switch off the engine. Yet while life inside the shelter grew warmer, the world outside began asking uncomfortable questions. It started with a photograph. Someone shared an image of Ethan helping Sophie hang another blue paper leaf on the mural tree, and within hours the picture had spread across television programs, newspapers, and countless social media accounts. Most comments celebrated the unlikely friendship, but others were far less generous. Some questioned his intentions. Others suggested the visits were carefully planned publicity. A few insisted that no successful businessman would devote so much time to one child unless there were something to gain. Ethan ignored the headlines at first. He had weathered criticism before. Markets rose and fell. Public opinion changed every week. But this time the stories did not stop with him. Reporters began calling the shelter. Volunteers found cameras waiting outside the entrance. Margaret worried that the children might begin feeling like exhibits instead of kids simply trying to grow up. During one board meeting at Carter Global, several directors expressed concern. They praised Ethan's generosity, but gently suggested that continuing his regular visits might expose both the company and the shelter to unnecessary attention. One executive carefully cleared his throat before speaking. "Perhaps your foundation could continue supporting Maple Grove financially without your personal involvement. It may be the safer approach." Ethan listened without interrupting. Months earlier, he probably would have agreed immediately. Efficiency had always won over emotion. This time he remained quiet for several moments before answering. If kindness becomes something we only do when no one questions it, then it is not kindness anymore. The room fell silent. No one argued, but the concern lingered. That evening, Ethan drove to Maple Grove as usual. He expected to find Sophie waiting by the front window, but instead Margaret met him outside beneath the porch light. Her smile was gentle, though worry rested behind her eyes. She explained that a woman had recently contacted the shelter claiming to be a distant relative of Sophie's family. According to the documents she presented, she wished to become involved in Sophie's future after years of little contact. Margaret emphasized that the process would follow every legal requirement and that Sophie's well-being would remain the priority, but she admitted the sudden appearance felt unexpected. Ethan glanced toward the brightly lit windows where children continued laughing over a board game, unaware of the conversations happening beyond the glass. "How is Sophie taking all of this?" he asked quietly. Margaret sighed. She asked whether she would still be allowed to finish reading the adventure book with you next Tuesday. Ethan smiled sadly. Out of every possible worry, that had been the one she carried. Moments later, the front door opened, and Sophie stepped onto the porch wearing her favorite blue sweater. She noticed the serious expressions and tilted her head with quiet curiosity. "Did something bad happen?" she asked. Ethan knelt beside her with the same calm patience he had shown on the night they first met. "No," he answered honestly. "Some grown-ups have important conversations to figure out." Sophie thought for a moment before slipping her small hand into his. "Then while they are talking," she said with complete confidence, "we should keep doing the important things too." Ethan gently squeezed her hand, realizing once again that the smallest voice in the conversation had somehow spoken the greatest truth. The following week, a quiet family court hearing was scheduled to determine the next steps for Sophie's future. It was not a dramatic courtroom filled with shouting voices or crowded spectators. Instead, it was a modest room with large windows overlooking the last golden leaves of autumn. A judge, a child advocate, Margaret, several social workers, and the woman who claimed to be Sophie's distant relative gathered around a long conference table. Ethan attended only because he had been asked to speak about his involvement with the shelter and the children's programs supported by his foundation. He had no expectation beyond answering a few questions honestly. The judge listened carefully as each person described Sophie's progress over the past months. Teachers spoke about her growing confidence. Volunteers described how she encouraged younger children whenever they felt afraid or uncertain. Margaret explained how Sophie had become a source of quiet hope inside Maple Grove, always believing that kindness had a way of finding people who needed it most. When it was Ethan's turn, he did not mention his company, his wealth, or the millions his foundation had donated over the years. He simply spoke about a little girl who reminded him that people could still choose compassion over distance. "I believed I was helping her," he said softly. "The truth is that she helped me remember the kind of man I wanted to be long before I became successful." The room remained silent for several moments. Then the judge smiled gently before looking toward Sophie. "You have listened very patiently today," she said. "Would you like to tell us how you feel?" Sophie nodded and climbed down from her chair. Instead of speaking immediately, she walked across the room until she stood beside Ethan. Everyone watched quietly, unsure what she intended to do. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand. Ethan looked down, surprised, then smiled as he held it. Sophie turned back toward the adults. "Everybody keeps asking who has been helping me," she said in her small but steady voice. "I think they are asking the wrong question." The judge leaned forward with quiet interest. "What do you mean, Sophie?" She looked up at Ethan before answering. "The night we met, I thought I needed a hug because I felt lonely. But when Mr. Carter hugged me, I could tell he felt lonely too." She paused for only a heartbeat before wrapping her arms gently around him once again. This time, Ethan embraced her without the slightest hesitation. There were no cameras, no reporters, no audience waiting to applaud. Only a quiet room where every person witnessed the same simple truth. Resting her head lightly against his shoulder, Sophie smiled and said, "He never promised to fix my whole life. He only kept showing up. And every time he came back, he reminded me that I mattered. I think grown-ups need someone to remind them of that too." A few eyes around the table quietly filled with tears. Even the court reporter paused for a brief second before continuing to type. The judge allowed the silence to linger because some moments deserved more respect than words could offer. Looking across the room, she finally spoke with gentle warmth. "Kindness is not measured by grand speeches or impressive titles. Sometimes it is measured by who keeps returning when no one is watching." Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment as Sophie's mother's letter echoed once again inside his heart. "One day you will meet someone who needs your hug more than you need theirs." Sitting in that quiet courtroom, He finally understood that the promise written on a worn piece of paper had reached exactly the person it was meant to find. 1 year later, spring returned to the city with flowering trees, warm sunlight, and the quiet promise that even the longest winters eventually came to an end. On a peaceful Saturday morning, families gathered outside a newly renovated community center where children chased bubbles across the lawn while volunteers welcomed neighbors with homemade lemonade and fresh blueberry muffins. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read, "The First Hug Foundation." There was no giant portrait of Ethan Carter, no polished monument celebrating wealth or success. Instead, visitors were greeted by a bronze sculpture standing in the center of a small garden. It showed a man kneeling to embrace a little girl, not as a hero rescuing someone in need, but as two lonely hearts finding each other halfway. Carved into the stone beneath the sculpture were the words, "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness become the greatest turning points in a life." Ethan stood quietly near the garden path, greeting guests with the same warm smile that had slowly become part of his everyday life. The expensive watches and tailored suits were still there, but they no longer defined him. Children tugged gently at his sleeve to show him drawings. Teachers stopped to share stories about their classrooms, and volunteers greeted him not as the famous businessman they had once admired from a distance, but simply as Ethan. A familiar laugh caught his attention. Sophie came running across the grass wearing another blue ribbon in her blonde hair, although this one was brighter than the first ribbon he had seen at the charity gala a year before. She carried a stack of handmade welcome cards she had spent the entire week preparing for every child visiting the center for the first time. "We have to make sure nobody feels invisible today," she said proudly before handing the first card to a shy little boy standing near the entrance. Ethan watched quietly, realizing she had become exactly the kind of person her mother had hoped she would be. The family court had eventually approved a permanent plan that allowed Sophie to remain surrounded by the people who had consistently cared for her, while Ethan became an officially recognized lifelong mentor and guardian within that support network, ensuring she always had stability, encouragement, and a place where she belonged. Papers had made their commitment official, but neither of them believed the relationship had begun with signatures. It had begun with one simple question asked by a little girl brave enough to believe that kindness was worth requesting. Later that afternoon, after the last guests had gone home, Ethan and Sophie sat together beneath a young maple tree planted beside the garden. Its branches were still small, but they stretched confidently toward the bright blue sky. Sophie leaned against him and smiled. "Do you remember when I asked you for a hug?" she whispered. Ethan laughed softly. "I remember thinking I was the one being generous." Sophie looked up with playful eyes. "You were wrong." He nodded without hesitation. "I know. I received much more than I ever gave." A gentle breeze rustled through the fresh green leaves overhead, carrying with it the peaceful sounds of children laughing somewhere nearby. Ethan thought about the handwritten letter folded safely inside his desk drawer, the blue paper leaf hanging on the mural tree at Maple Grove, the photographs returned to his home, and the walls around his heart that no longer existed. True wealth had never been waiting inside boardrooms, investment portfolios, or impressive buildings. It had been waiting inside moments too ordinary for headlines to notice. A shared smile, a handwritten note, a promise quietly kept, and above all, one unexpected hug that reminded two lonely souls that love does not always arrive with answers. Sometimes it simply arrives with open arms,